Welcome back to my channel for a Leica episode about the autofocus system of the by now well-established Leica SL3 and the newly introduced Leica SL3-S. And in my intro video on this camera here, I showed that the autofocus system of the two cameras is exactly the same, so I can cover them both in one shot. And a lot of people asked for that video, and on one hand, autofocus settings on these two cameras are straightforward. On the other side, or the flip side of the coin, there are a few things to note and to remark, and I will show and demonstrate in this video everything you need to know about the autofocus system of these two Leica system cameras. Let's kick this off. Before I go right into the topic, if you have not done so yet, please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, help me to grow my content and spread it into the world of camera and photography enthusiasts and professional photographers. I will appreciate that. We will have the benefit with a growing community, and everyone will be happy at the end of the year when finally we will reach with this channel, hopefully 100,000 subscribers. So help me to reach that goal. And now let's go into the autofocus system of the Leica SL3 and the SL3-S. And the first thing I want to do is kind of showing you that the autofocus settings on both cameras are exactly the same. So if I go into the control screen here, I have here the different autofocus modes: intelligent autofocus, single, continuous and manual focus. And that's exactly the same on the Leica SL3 as what you just saw on the SL3-S. Let's quickly go there. So we have here manual focus, autofocus continuous, autofocus single, and intelligent autofocus. So from this side, everything is exactly the same. Then if we go into the autofocus mode, let's go here to the menu system, and we'll cover that all in detail later. We have here from the right hand side animal detection, that's in beta state. We have eye, face, body detection, tracking, zone, field, spot, and we have multi-field. And that it's exactly the same on the Leica SL3. Let's quickly go there. So we go here to the autofocus settings, and we have again from the right hand side animals beta, eye, face, body detection, we have tracking, we have zone, we have field, we have spot, and we have multi-field. So here we are exactly compatible. There is no difference. If you know how to use the autofocus system on the Leica SL3, it's a piece of cake for you to use it on the SL3-S. And in this video I will now focus on the SL3-S because it's the newer camera. I have my models here placed on the table. I want to illustrate a lot of things which will be helpful for your shooting, and I hope you will appreciate and enjoy the presentation. So get yourself a coffee, lean back and enjoy the show. Let's now look into autofocus a bit more systematically. We just saw that on both cameras we have 3 autofocus modes and 7 autofocus metering methods. And that's the words, the nomenclature which is used in the manual from Leica itself. And the 3 autofocus modes you saw before is intelligent autofocus, autofocus single, and autofocus continuous. Intelligent autofocus is something I hardly use. Generally, if you are a photo enthusiast or a professional photographer, go for AFS or AFC. Never go for IAF. We have the 7 autofocus metering methods. We also just saw multi-field, spot, field, zone, tracking, eye, face, body detection, and animal detection. I want to show a few of them live in a moment. The big difference between autofocus single and autofocus continuous is the following. Whenever I'm half pressing the shutter button and I'm in AFS and the subject in the scene is moving, focus will not be updated. Whereas in autofocus continuous, and that's why it is called continuous, if I'm half pressing the shutter button and keep it half pressed down, whenever the subject is moving, focus will be updated continuously as long as the subject moves in the focusing range of the lens. Of course, if a subject comes closer than the minimum focusing distance, focus will be lost too, in the same way as under AFS. But as long as the subject moves within the focusing distance of the lens, continuous autofocus will permanently update the focus so that your subject stays sharp and crisp. Now, what's also important to take into account here is when we talk about autofocus modes and AFS and AFC, is that this can of course be combined with drive mode settings. And in drive mode, I'm going to show this in a moment, we have single and continuous. Continuous is the burst shooting, and the Leica SL3-S, the new one, has significant advantages here compared to the Leica SL3, which has been in the market for a while already. Alright, so I'm now in autofocus single here. You see it here activated, and I'm in field autofocus mode for metering. And on light and exposure metering, I'm at center weighted. And watch now what happens if my subject in the scene is moving. And for this, in still image photography, I half press the shutter button and continue half pressing it. And now I move Jennifer closer to the camera. Have a look, my finger is still half pressing the shutter button. Jennifer is no longer sharp. And I move her back, focus returns. I move her further away, and Jennifer is again no longer sharp. I have my aperture here widest open at f2.0. Watch now what happens if I go to autofocus continuous. Let's go here, let's activate autofocus continuous. Let's focus on Jennifer, crisp and sharp. I move closer to the camera. She stays sharp. See that? I can move far away from the camera. She stays sharp. And that's what autofocus continuous is doing for you. It's as long as you half press down the shutter button, continuously updating the focus to make sure it sits where your field is in autofocus metering. And that's how it works. Of course, I can move my field now and focus on the Witcher in the background. And then Jennifer is out of focus, but the Witcher is in focus because I have a shallow depth of field here with widest open f2.0. But that's the way it works. And the difference between continuous and single autofocus is that under continuous autofocus, I will get an update where my focus field is sitting. And on single autofocus, this will not update and focus will be lost. If you photograph sports and action, it's very meaningful if you have continuous autofocus. And in this way, focus is continuously updating. You can combine this, of course, with burst rate shooting. And for this, you go into drive mode. And then in drive mode, you have single. And then you have the different burst rates here. And for the Leica SL3-S, you can actually go up to 30 frames per second with 12-bit image quality and full autofocus support, which is very, very nice. That exceeds by far what the Leica SL3 can do for you in sports and action. Plus, you have the lower resolution. And the lower resolution of 24 megapixel, of course, is also helping in a more snappy, more speedy autofocus process. Now, when it comes to the autofocus metering methods, metering sounds a little bit like light metering or exposure metering, but it's not. So don't get confused about that. It's really about metering the focus. And that's important. Of course, if your focus field is sitting in a certain position in the frame, and you have certain light metering parameters set on the camera, the place where autofocus metering and light metering or exposure metering happens is maybe coincidentally the same place. But generally, when we talk about autofocus metering methods, we really talk about multi-field spot, field zone tracking, eye face body detection, and animal detection. That's important to not confuse these concepts, autofocus metering and exposure metering. If we go systematically through these autofocus metering methods, the first one is multi-field. And multi-field means you give away the control on what to focus from yourself, the photographer, to the camera. And that's something I never use because I want to decide myself where the focus is supposed to sit and not leave it to the camera. But for snapshots, as the Leica manual says, this might be a useful function for beginners. Looking now into multi-field metering. So currently we are here in field. And you have the different options here. So multi-field, spot, field, we have zone, we have tracking, eye face body detection, and animal detection. Let's go to multi-field for a moment. And let's go first into autofocus single. And if I go there, then you see the autofocus field will try to detect something it can focus on. And that's what I mean when I say you give up control over your focusing process to the camera. And typically, in particular, if it is detectable subjects like human bodies, it will focus on the body which is closest to the camera. So here, if I want, I cannot move to the Witcher. I can try, but there is no focus field to move. For this, I would have to go into field autofocus metering, and then I have a focus field I can control. You see, now I can focus on the Witcher. Now I focus back on Jennifer. If I'm in multi-field, that is not possible. The camera decides for you. And that's why I never use multi-field, because with multi-field, I have no way to focus on the Witcher in the background and getting the focus away from Jennifer. It will always detect the first human body in the scene. That's why multi-field is not an option I recommend for more advanced photographers. You have no longer control about where the focus is sitting. The next autofocus metering method is spot, and then it's field. And Leica in the manual talks about both of them simultaneously. And the big difference is that with spot, you see a cross in the camera viewfinder, and it helps you to measure very, very precisely where autofocus should be metered. So let's say you want to, for instance, focus on the button on a shirt of a person, then spot metering is the right way to go. Field metering has a bit more tolerance, but is still useful for precise focusing, and field metering might be one of the focusing metering methods I use most in my shooting if it is not about people photography, when of course I go for eye, face and body detection. Let's move to the next focus metering method, and that is spot. So let's go here, let's go to spot. And what you see now here is a tiny little cross. And let's go to Jennifer's body, so you better see this here in the dark areas. I'm now at the lower part of the frame, and you see that white cross, and that's the most precise way to meter focus. And let's go on her wrist here, for instance, and now I have the focus widest open at f2.0 exactly sitting on Jennifer's wrist. And you can now switch to a focus field and make it small. That will have the same effect, but sometimes what you want to focus on might be so tiny, so small, that this is the way to go, spot focus metering. So let's switch now to field. Let's go here to field. And if I'm in field, I get this focus field here. And this focus field can also be resized. If I press and hold here, I can actually pinch by touchscreen, or I use the control wheel here, and you see this is the smallest version, this is medium size, and this is large size. And I typically have the smallest version here. Let's go back into focusing mode, and then I can also precisely focus. Even without eye, face and body detection, I can focus nicely on Jennifer's face. I can switch my focus to the Witcher. Let's go to the Witcher's head here. Let's focus. So here's the focus. You see this is fairly quick now on the SL3-S. And if you have a larger focus field, you have more tolerance. The camera might be able to catch something quicker, but it's also not as precise as if you have the small focus field in its smallest version, or even the spot metering field. And let's make this big for a moment. Let's go here to the biggest size. All right. And sometimes if you have, I mean, here it's obvious, even if I take her hand, it will still focus on her hand, because that's something which the camera knows, that the hand is likely I want to take a photo of and not the background. But if there are tiny little elements you want to photograph which are in the foreground, there is a danger if your focus field is too large that the camera all of a sudden starts to focus on the background instead of that tiny little element in the foreground, and that's something to bear in mind. Here's a typical example of that. I was playing for a while to find a part of the scene where I can demonstrate this. Look, here is the focus field sitting. It's very large, and I want to get Jennifer in the foreground, sharp and in focus, but it's always focusing on the background TV. You see that? And if I want to change that, want to more precisely tell the camera where the focus has to sit, I have to resize this again. So let's go back here to small. And now if I focus, it will find Jennifer again. It was hunting a little bit forth and back, but it found Jennifer. And with the large size focus field, this didn't work. It focused on the background. That's why I said, bear in mind what the right focus field size for you is and for what you want to achieve. Zone autofocus metering is basically, let's call it a commingling between multi-field and between spot and field. Because you see here in the illustration in the manual, there are several focus fields, and within this group of focus fields, the camera can detect where the focus likely is supposed to sit. And that's actually a good compromise. If you're a beginner and come from multi-field focusing and you want to progress into controlling more yourself where the focus is supposed to sit, then zone metering is a good method, and I can recommend playing with it because it will give you much better results than the multi-field metering method, but it is not as, let's say, demanding as spot or field metering. So it's somewhere sitting between the lines here, and is a good compromise between these different metering methods. The next metering method for focus is zone. So let's go back here and let's go here into zone. And now in zone, you see here these tiny little dashes. I go to the left hand side for a moment so you see them. And this is the zone where focus happens in between these markers. And you see I can focus on Jennifer, and where the focus is found, it indicates this to me with green tiny little focus fields. You see that? Now it's on Jennifer's right hand side arm. And that indicates me where the focus is currently sitting. If I don't like it, I can try to move that zone, But of course, it's not as precise as if I'm in field or spot metering. And I said before, it's a compromise basically between multi-field and field metering, with the difference that here all the autofocus points which become relevant are captured in a certain smaller frame in between these auxiliary lines. Let's try to go to the Witcher, and you see I can now not focus on the Witcher because it's not finding focus here. Let's try to go down here. Here it is now. Now it found the Witcher's arm. It's again the right hand side arm. You see these tiny little green focus fields here, which indicate that's where the focus is sitting currently, but is not precise. It's an improvement to multi-field because it's measuring, it's metering focus in a dedicated zone, but it's not giving you full control over your focus, where the focus is sitting. That's why zone is, by me, used only on very rare occasions. I really prefer spot, field, and then tracking and eye face body detection, which I'm going to show in a moment. Now, tracking is a very interesting autofocus metering method because no matter what is moving in the scene, you can use tracking to track and keep the focus sitting on the subject that is moving. And that is something I'm going to illustrate now, of course. And there is one important note which is here in the manual, and that says the following, namely, no matter whether you are on the focusing mode, in autofocus single or continuous, the moment in time the metering method is tracking, it makes only sense, of course, if you are on continuous autofocus. So the camera will automatically ignore that you might have said before you want to be in AFS and will automatically switch to AFC if you activate in the metering method the tracking mode. Let's move on to tracking. So here we go. The next one is tracking. And in tracking you see we have now a nice indication here of a focus field. And it's also jumping a little bit forth and back from time to time. Now it's more on Jennifer's elbow. And now it's sitting just below Jennifer's elbow. So that's where the focus is sitting. Of course, I make it a bit harder for the camera here because I have the aperture widest open, but that's what this is all about, right? Why should I make it easy for the camera to do what I want it to do? And now let's track. Let's see what happens. It's now on Jennifer's body. It's not on the face, on the eye, but it's tracking Jennifer nicely. So Jennifer could be a car now, could be a bike, could be something else which is moving, but it will remain sticky, and this subject, which currently is Jennifer's body, will stay in focus if I activated tracking. That's the way it works. And the main difference between eye, face and body detection and between tracking is that tracking is eligible for all kinds of subjects. It doesn't need to be a face or a body. It can be a car, it can be a bike. It can be something else that is moving, like a ball in the air, whatever it is. And as long as I half press the shutter button, that's important to note here. I need to half press the shutter button. You see my pointing finger on the shutter button here. As long as that is the case, it tracks. And if I get too close to the camera within the near distance, then it starts to lose focus and this tracking field becomes red. Have a look here. Now I'm violating the near distance focusing and I have to move back and then it catches up. But this is very sticky. Look, that is actually, in terms of my experience, a large improvement the way it is sticky compared to the Leica SL3. Based on probably more training, based on, I guess, the lower resolution, which might be a really contributing factor here, and whatever it is. But this is really, really snappy. Look at that. Looks really good. All right, so that's tracking. And there's one more remark to make here. And I just mentioned I continuously half press the shutter button and then it's tracking in the way, but you can also use the joystick for that and control the tracking with your thumb. And in order to do that, we go into the menu, and in the menu we go here into Customize Control. And in Customize Control we have the joystick. And in the joystick in autofocus mode, I can also set this to autofocus on. Have a look here. And now I can get my pointing finger off the shutter release button and can keep pushing the joystick and it will also track. Have a look. It's the same effect as if I use the shutter button and press it halfway down. It will track as long as I push the joystick. And for some people that's the more convenient way to actually do a tracking, because you get additional control with your pointing finger over the shutter release button for, you know, releasing the shot when the time is right. And that might be the more convenient way. Have a look here. Let me focus. Autofocus on. As long as I press the joystick here, it's tracking. If I come too close, the focus field becomes red, lost focus, but then it catches up, and here we go. So bear this in mind. You can have this function here on customize control. If you go to the joystick and then you have here autofocus on. I use the joystick typically for auto exposure lock, which is more important for me. But you know, there are different tastes out there, and this is at least an option you should have if you want to control your tracking in this way. What's also interesting, and I'm going to show that in the camera in a moment, you can actually determine in subject detection and tracking settings from where the tracking should start. Should it start from the center of the frame or from the last position where it's been before, or should it recall the starting position of the most recent tracking process? And that is also something very interesting where you get even more control about subject tracking if subjects are moving in the scene and you want to make sure that the focus is sitting firmly on these subjects. Let's now look into the tracking starting position. So let's go into the menu and let's find this. It's at the very beginning of the menu here under focus settings. And if you go to autofocus setup, we have here the autofocus tracking start position. And currently this is at center. What it means basically is that always the tracking starts at the center. See, I half press the shutter button and then it finds focus, and it's always starting at the center. And let's change this now. Well, let's first of all move Jennifer. Let's illustrate this live here. So let's track, half pressing the shutter button. Let's get Jennifer here in the left hand side corner. Let's stop tracking, and then it snaps back into the center of the frame. That's the center. If I now push it, it will actually focus on the background because it lost focus on Jennifer, and tracking starts in the center of the frame, which is very likely not what I want. So let's get Jennifer back into the center. Let's start tracking her. Let's move her out again, and let's change this setting now. So let's go back into the menu, focus setting, autofocus setup, and let's say we go to the last tracking position. Let's activate this. I track her, I move her out, and I stop tracking. The focus field remains here. It's not jumping back as before into the center of the frame. And now I can continue to track Jennifer and guide her back into the center of the frame. And now the focus field will stay here. You see the difference? Let's do this again. Let's move her here. And the focus field stays on where I last stopped tracking. That's why the menu entry is called last. Let's go back here. Last. Let's go back to center so you see it. The moment in time I now focus on Jennifer and move her around and release the halfway pressed down shutter button, the focus field jumps back into the center and will not stay here in the same way as what it did when I had last in that setting. See here? It's back in the center. Let's go to the other setting for the sake of completeness. So we go here into focus setting, autofocus setup, center. Let's go to recall. And let's illustrate this one. In order to illustrate this setting, I will now move Jennifer a little bit aside and will move my tracking field to Jennifer. And the moment in time I now half press the shutter button, or if I want to do it via the joystick here in that setting I showed before, the camera will remember that I started tracking here at the left hand side of the frame, and it will jump back to that position. So let's have a look. I track Jennifer, I guide her over to the other side, right hand side. Still half pressing the shutter button. If I release it now, it will jump back to where it recalls the tracking started. Boom, here it is. You see that? And of course, if I now here focus, it will be the background again. But there are different applications for these three settings. I typically have this at the center. Let's get Jennifer here for one more time because it's so much fun. Let's get her focused. Come on, show me Jennifer. Here we go. Let's track her to the other side. Let's release the shutter release button, and then it jumps where it started tracking. Boom. Simple like that. So I hope I illustrated this menu entry now, and you understand how it is working. Different situations require different settings here. The center position is the standard. So if we go here into the menu and we have here center, that's the standard, and that's also how the camera is shipped out of box. But let's make an example where recall is meaningful and where last can be meaningful. Let's go here to recall again. And let's start tracking Jennifer from here. And this is a situation where now different people always walk into the scene from the left-hand side, cross the scene to the right-hand side. And I start tracking here with Jennifer, I follow her, I take my pictures, and then I release the shutter button and the next person comes into the image, and now I can start tracking again. And now the witcher is tracked. So if people are walking from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, it might be a meaningful setting to always have it jumping back to the left hand side in the way I just illustrated, or to the position which the camera recalls was where the tracking started. In terms of the last position, there are also applications for that. Let me go here, let me go to last. And now I have Jennifer here, I can track her. Let's go basically to the left hand side again, let's track her. And let's walk with her to the right hand side. And now I'm in last, so it will stay here and will not move from Jennifer's body. I release the shutter button with my pointing finger here and it stays here, and that's a situation where Jennifer might move back into the frame. So if I follow a single person and don't want to catch up with a second one entering the frame from the left hand side, this might be the right setting for me for the tracking, but very often it will be on center. And as I said, it's a standard setting if you get the camera out of box. Let me also quickly demonstrate how autofocus single is overwritten by autofocus continuous in the way the camera behaves if I'm in tracking mode. So I'm here in tracking, I can track Jennifer's body here, and I'm here in autofocus continuous, but if I go here to autofocus single, it will still track and the autofocus will update continuously. Have a look, half pressing the shutter button. Here we go. Jennifer remains sharp and in focus, there is no problem, you see that? And that's what I said before when we looked at the presentation. And then finally we come to eye face body detection. I've shown this many times on my channel for the Leica SL2 for instance and the SL3-S. And that's better illustrated in a live demonstration. And then there is also animal detection, and the manual from Leica clearly says that animal detection is an enhanced version of eye face body detection for human beings, because it's also artificial intelligence based trained to recognize certain typical pet types. And these are essentially the same technologies, and Leica for quite a while already uses artificial intelligence machine learning to train the camera algorithms for detection of eyes, faces, bodies and so on. And animal and human body detection or face detection is essentially the same, just here you have a larger scope to also include animals. And I recommend to always be specific. If you're taking photos of your cats or your dog, really go to animal detection. If it is about human beings only, narrow it down to human beings and go to eye, face and body detection. Let's now move on to eye, face and body detection, and let's go here back to continuous. And let's go here into eye, face, body detection. As I mentioned, the animal detection in beta version is the same as eye, face, body detection for human beings, but it is additionally trained also for the recognition of pets like dogs, cats, birds, and so on. And I think we can restrict ourselves to the eye, face, body detection. And you see how the focus immediately detects here Jennifer's face. And if I half press the shutter button, you also see that the left-hand side eye indication is green and the right-hand side eye indication is white. That means the focus is sitting now on the left-hand side eye. If I want to toggle that, I can use the joystick in the corresponding direction, and now it should be the right-hand side eye, which is green. And here we go. So that's very easy and it works like a charm. Let's get the second person into the scene. Let's get the Witcher also into the scene here. So here we go. Currently is detecting only the Witcher's face, is not detecting his eyes. Maybe the color of the Witcher's eyes are red glowing, and that is supernatural and my camera refuses to accept that. But we have Jennifer's face, and I can now, in the same way as I toggled between Jennifer's eyes, left hand side, right hand side, I can toggle between faces. So I can go here and go to the Witcher's face, and now I can focus on the Witcher's face, and I can go back to Jennifer's face, and then it's the left hand side eye. Another push is the right hand side eye, as you can see in the green color. Now it's the left hand side eye again, and the next push takes me to the Witcher's face. Simple like that. So whenever you have several persons in the room, the camera will recognize the faces, and you can use the joystick and push it in the corresponding direction to reach someone else's face or to switch between different eyes. Let's get the Witcher out of the way. I want to show something else. It's only Jennifer now. And you see, I don't have my hands here on the shutter release button. I just have them with me, and it will still recognize the face. You see that? It's not necessarily sharp. You see now the face is not sharp, but it's still recognized. If I want to get it sharp, I have to half press the shutter button, and if I keep pushing it halfway down, it will also update the focus because I'm in autofocus continuous. You see that? Works very, very well. And I think generally tracking, but also eye, face, body detection, That is a game changer on the Leica SL3, the SL3-S, which is even faster very likely because of the lower resolution, and of course also on the Q3-43 and the Q3-28. A game changer compared to generations of previous Leica cameras. Is working really, really well. And I think in terms of that section, I've said everything I wanted to say, and I move on to other settings here when it comes to autofocus. The autofocus system of the SL3-S, after all these improvements by Leica, and that also applies to the SL3, is still not the best and most snappy autofocus system in the world. It's not a match for a Nikon C9 or a Nikon C8, or let's say a Sony Alpha 1 Mark II or a Sony A7R Mark V, what have you. It's not a match, right? And if you're after the fastest autofocus system in the world, the Leica SL3 and SL3-S are not cameras you should even consider. But autofocus works reasonably well. I was able to catch birds in flight, and here's an example of it. And that is something which would have been kind of impossible with a Leica SL or Leica SL2. And now with the Leica SL3 it works, and the SL3-S will be even more speedy with autofocus based on lower resolution and on the improvements Leica made in the overall calibration of the camera. But it's not the fastest in the world, and there are two switches in the system which might help you to become faster with the autofocus and speeding it up. And the first one is pre-focus, and that means when the function is activated, the camera, even if you don't half press the shutter button, is still screening and scanning in front of the lens the situation and the scene for subjects to focus on. And that is supposed to speed up your focusing process if you then half press down the shutter button significantly. And the second applies to macro shootings. In macro shootings, you're typically in a near distance, and so it's pointless for the lens to hunt for focus outside of that near distance. And that's why you can limit the focus range here for macro type shootings. And both will improve the speed of finding focus and where the focus is supposed to sit according to the subject in the scene. In the menu we find these settings here. We go again to focus settings and then to autofocus setup, and here's the pre-focus. And this can really speed up the time the camera needs to find focus, that it sits where you want it to sit. So you can keep this on and activate it like I have it here, if autofocus speed is really a concern for you. But it also consumes battery power, of course. And if you are more on the battery power saving side, you can also deactivate it by a push on the joystick. It's generally safe to leave it on at all times. It cannot harm. It will very likely make your autofocus speedier and faster. But as I said, it comes at an expense and a cost, because the camera is then permanently screening the scene in front of the camera for potential subjects where you might decide to focus on. And then the macro limiting setting is here. If you go down, it's currently grayed out because I don't have a macro lens on the camera here, but if it would be recognized as a macro lens, then I could activate this and it will limit my focusing range to the near distance, which can also significantly speed up your focusing process in macro shootings. And then there is a sub-menu on autofocus fine-tuning, and there are three parameters you can tweak here. There is the depth sensitivity, the field movement, and the shift in direction. And there's always a distinction in the manual between switching to lower values and switching to higher values. And you can here, for instance, address the difference in different types of movements. So is it a more steady movement which you want to track? Is it a more erratic movement, like for instance if you're trying to shoot a basketball game? And in my personal experience, because this menu is available for a while on Leica SL cameras, it's not necessarily helpful to touch these settings, but if you understand how they work and you gain experience in experimenting, then it's a useful additional way to tweak your parameters for your tracking and for being sticky with the focus on a subject that is moving in a certain way. Fine-tuning autofocus settings in the menu works under autofocus setup, and then we go into autofocus profiles. And first of all, we can here decide in the profile what we are actually trying to track and taking photos of. Is it children and pets, standard movements? Is it team sport with more fast and unexpected change in direction, like in basketball or soccer, for instance? Is it a runner with constant movement? Or is it wildlife where something suddenly appears in the forest and then has a very sudden, surprising change in direction? And that helps and is very likely based on artificial intelligence and machine learning trained in these separate buckets, so that you can have the best autofocus performance for these 4 different profiles here. And then if we go back, We have here depth sensitivity, as I mentioned, field movement and shift in direction. I've tweaked this here to +1, but as I said, it's a bit experimental, and you get typically, if you go into that, you get here a scale where you have in both directions two moves you can make to +2 or -2 or -1 and +1. And you should try it for yourself what for certain situations works best for you, and should not rely too much on it. I think it's also safe to just keep your fingers off that, but I use it from time to time, and I can say it helps a little bit. It's not a game changer if you go into these fine-tuning sections here and decide to tweak the depth sensitivity, the field movement, or the shift in direction. I think this one here has much more influence, how successful and fast your autofocus speed is. There are a bunch of other topics I want to quickly show now in a live demonstration on the camera. There are autofocus quick settings, autofocus access in manual focusing, touch autofocus, which is straightforward, can be very useful, in particular if the camera is on a tripod. Autofocus behavior in video mode I will quickly cover, because everything I said for still image photography will also more or less apply to videography. And then there is a nice feature for videographers which I personally love, and that's called follow focus, but essentially it's a focus pull. And I will do a dedicated short video on that, because I think that's actually the longest section in the Leica SL3 and SL3-S manual, because it's not really straightforward how to use this feature. So there will be a different short video which you can enjoy in a week or a couple of weeks, where I will show how this works. But these are the things I want to quickly cover now, and then I want to wrap up the video. I already covered, and that's part of autofocus quick settings, how to change the size of your focus field. So I'm currently here in field, and if I want to change that, I just tap and hold, and then I can tweak the size from small to medium to large. I can also use pinch to zoom for that. Have a look here. I can use my fingers to do that. I don't like touch functionality too much. It's not precise enough, and depending on the weather conditions, not necessarily reacting. You can also change the size in zone focusing. So let me quickly show that to you. If we go here into zone, and we have zone here, I can do the same thing. First of all, remember, I programmed, remember, if you have seen my tutorials on the Leica SL3 and SL3-S, I programmed the FN button to center the focus field. So here it is back in the center. Let's press and hold, and now I can also here change the size. This is the largest, this is medium, and this is the smallest zone of focusing points which become relevant here. And in this way you can also get a finer measurement of where the focus is supposed to sit. And let's go quickly for another autofocus quick setting into tracking again. And again, now I can track here. I'm in continuous autofocus. Let me check. Yes. So I can track Jennifer's body here. But also here I can tap and hold. And then I get the focusing menu here. So I can very quickly switch here to eye, face, body detection, and so on. So these are the autofocus quick settings, which is one topic I wanted to at least quickly mention. So there is an option if you are in manual focusing mode to actually override via autofocus. And let me quickly show you how this works. So first of all, I switched back here to autofocus single, and I have field focus metering. So I can move my focus field, what have you. Let's go now into manual. Let's center it back. Let's go now into manual focus. So I go here to manual focus, and now focus is no longer picking up, of course. Let's get Jennifer closer so she becomes fuzzy. I cannot use half pressing the shutter button. I have to manually take the focus ring and then focus. See, now it's sharp. Let's go up to Jennifer's face. Let's see if I get her sharp and in focus. That's it. That's Jennifer. All right. Now I can also use still autofocus if I want. And let's center this back, and I'll show you how this works. So first of all, let's go here into the menu, and then in the menu, let's go to custom controls. We have it here. And then I can actually go to the joystick, which I did before. And in manual focus mode, I can say I want to have here on the joystick push autofocus single, autofocus continuous, or I want to combine it with auto exposure lock. Let's go to autofocus single. Let's have a look here. And now if I manually focus, let's get her out of focus. Let's go back to Jennifer's face, and let's keep the focus field here this time. I cannot correct via half pressing the shutter button, but I can now activate autofocus single by pushing the joystick. See? Now it's sharp, and sometimes that's helpful, because even if you want to do fine-tuning on the focus, it gives you a first indication if you use this focusing via the joystick here. Let's get this even better, for instance, for macro photography, which is a typical application for manual focusing. I use in macro photography most of the time actually manual focusing, sometimes also autofocus, but let's assume for a moment we have such a situation. Let's go into the menu, let's stay in manual focus, but let's go to tracking. This is here. And now we have a very interesting situation and constellation. Let's go further into customize controls and the joystick. And on the manual focus mode, let's now have here autofocus continuous. Watch what happens. First of all, let's get Jennifer out of focus. Now I need to manually focus, but I'm lazy, don't want to do it. Half pressing the shutter button only takes me back into the full scene here. And now I push the joystick. Immediately it gets sharp, and the good thing now is, since I have autofocus continuous and tracking, which might be helpful for a little bee or fly you are focusing on, I can keep pushing and it will actually track the subject. You see, it remains sharp if I keep pushing the joystick. That's very helpful, that's good, and I still have precise focusing control via manual focus. If I want, I can correct. It also gives me the magnification because that's what I set up. But I can also use the joystick as an auxiliary measure to help me and to get an indication, a first indication of where the focus should sit. So that's very nice. I think that's all I wanted to say to manual focusing and overriding this via autofocus and the joystick here. And let's move on to the next settings. So there are two remaining items I wanted to quickly cover. I already mentioned that follow focus in video mode, which is a focus pull. I'm going to do a separate video on that, but the two topics I want to quickly cover is behavior of autofocus when we are in video mode and also touch autofocus. And touch autofocus is also under focus settings. And then we have it here. Currently it's switched off because I'm just not a touch person when it comes to photography. But if I go into this sub menu here, I have three options. I have off, which is my standard setting. I can touch autofocus and release the shot. And I have touch autofocus. And let's choose this one here. Let's go back into live view and let's quickly look into the control screen here so that you see what I have here. I'm an autofocus single and on field autofocus metering. And now I can by touch move the focus field. Have a look here. And it's focusing now on the background. Let's bring this back to Jennifer. It's focusing on Jennifer. That's the way it works. So instead of moving it with the joystick and then centering it again with the FN button, which I programmed, I can just tap wherever I want and it's focusing. Of course, this will be in the workflow much quicker if it also releases the shot immediately. So let's go here and let's activate this in the menu, focus settings. And then we go to autofocus and release. And then wherever I tap, it will focus there and release the shot immediately. So let's do this here. Let's tap to the background and take a shot. Here we go. Let's tap back on Jennifer, take the shot. Here we go. So that's the way it works. If you like to work with touch functionality, which we're all used to from our iPhones or Android phones, then this is a good function for you because it's very quick. Let's focus on the camera here. See the Sony camera. Let's go back to Jennifer. And here we go, wasting a lot of shutter releases. And that's a good option. You can also configure this separately for the electronic viewfinder. Let's go back here into focus settings, and then you have here, this is for the LCD screen, and here you have it for the electronic viewfinder, which is kind of working in the same way. And I always find this a bit inconvenient if I have my eye on the electronic viewfinder working with this. So this is off in my setting, but it's something you can use, of course, if you want so. As another item under tips and tricks, I've reconfigured my control screen now to autofocus continuous and tracking. And then it becomes really useful. Have a look here. So currently Jennifer's out of focus, but I want to track her. So I just focus on her and half press the shutter button, and then I immediately there. If I would have here in the center to use my joystick, that might take much longer than just tapping with my finger on her and then tracking her. You know, so also in tracking mode, of course, this works with the touch autofocus, and you can combine this with all kind of different settings in the menu, of course. All right, last but not least, let's quickly, very quickly look into the video mode, because everything is kind of the same, with I think one difference I wanted to point out. And then I have one more quick tip for you at the very end. So let's swipe here into video mode and let's quickly see what we have here in the control screen. Of course, we go here now to aperture priority. We go to autofocus continuous. We go here to eye, face, body detection because we are dealing with Jennifer. What else do we need? I think that's it. What's here on the metering? We go for center weighted again. And here we go. Now that's the setting I have. It's not important what type of video settings I have. It's just important that it recognizes Jennifer's face. And what I wanted to show now is, of course, if I half press the shutter button, I can push it down and start recording. So let's do this here. It's now recording. And what you find is that even with me, of course, the pointing finger off the shutter release button, it's keeping under tracking and continuous autofocus Jennifer's face sharp and in focus. And that is what you want in video, of course. You don't want to have half pressing your shutter button all the time as you do in still image photography, and it's just sticky on Jennifer here. See that? And that's the major difference. Here you don't need to always half press the shutter button down. The moment in time you record, it will stay on Jennifer's face and will also track it. Everything else in video mode is kind of the same. If you look into the menu here, you have here focusing mode in the same way as what we had before. We have the famous follow focus, which is the focus pull. As I said, this will be a different video. Don't miss it. Stay tuned on my channel and watch this video because this is for videographers. A fantastic feature you don't have typically on other cameras. And we have then here the autofocus mode, and we went here to eye face body detection, but we have all the other options here in the same way as we have it in still images. We have focus settings. You see it looks exactly the same, and so on and so on. So there is not much in addition to say since we covered everything in still image photography. But the video mode, of course, allows you, once you start recording, to just hold the camera and get your pointing finger off the shutter release button, and it will still track the face of Jennifer or track a subject if you are in tracking mode and so on. Alright, one last item before I conclude the video, and that's an important one because if you are not super familiar with Leica cameras, that might confuse you. I showed you before under custom control. Let's go there. Here we go, custom control on the joystick, how you could say here autofocus on. And that basically helped us by pushing the joystick and holding it to focus on Jennifer. It works with tracking. It works here in my setting. I'm just in autofocus single and in field, but you can go to autofocus continuous here, for instance. Let's go there, and let's also go here to eye face body detection, and then I focus and it will track Jennifer. You see it stays green if I push that joystick here. But if you then want to use touch autofocus, something might happen that will confuse you. Let's go there. Let's go quickly back into focus settings. So let's go here. We have touch autofocus. Let's say we make touch autofocus here. So this is there. All right. And of course, first of all, I can now tap and focus on something different. That's not a problem. And it will stay on Jennifer's body. It's not recognizing yet her face, only if I half press the shutter button. But if I'm in a different focusing mode, let's go here to just tracking. And I want to show you that. Now I'm on tracking, and now you see the shutter release button is deactivated. It's no longer working. I can half press the shutter button, and here's a little engraving on the LCD screen. Engraving is the wrong word. A little let's say, hint. Autofocus on, which means the focus is now sitting on the joystick. And if I half press the shutter button, nothing happens. See, I can place my focus field differently, but it's also not focusing in this particular mode when I'm just in pure tracking. Not in the same way as if I would go here to field. Let's go to field. Now I can focus on the background, can focus back on Jennifer. But if I'm in tracking, and there are tiny little specialties which you need to be aware of, which can be confusing for beginners, I can tap, it will not focus. I can tap, it will not focus. And even half pressing the shutter release button is not helping here. It's just the joystick. Have a look, Jennifer again, if I push the joystick. So that's the last thing I wanted to say. If sometimes in certain constellations something is not working, like here for instance, the shutter release button, look at that again, then typically you get a hint in the display, and this hint says autofocus on. And if you look it up in the manual, it will tell you why all of a sudden half pressing the shutter button has no longer any effect on what's going on here. You decided to have it on the joystick. If we deactivate this again, let's go to custom control. You will get back the familiar behavior. So let's go here. I have typically the joystick on auto exposure lock. That's what I want. So here we go. And now it's different. Have a look here. I can focus now again with my shutter release button, and can also get it back in tracking. That didn't work before with the shutter release button. It was deactivated, but that hint here, autofocus on, is also gone now. So be careful with these settings. If something confuses you, there's always a solution. Just be a bit experimental, look into the manual, and you will very likely find your answer, or you ask someone in our community on the channel. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.